Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the horizon is endless, the justice is swift, and a man's past is a shadow he can never outrun. Tonight, we tell a story of a man cast out, a ghost hunted for crimes he never committed. It's a tale about whether a man's final act can erase a lifetime of condemnation. So find a comfortable spot and listen closely to the story of the Outlaw's last ride. The sun was a merciless hammer on the anvil of the desert. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the skeletal remains of long-dead cacti, and on the lone figure of a man who was, in many ways, just as much a relic as the landscape he traversed. His name was Eli McGraw, but no one had called him that in a long time. For 5 years, he had been a whisper, a rumor, a ghost. They called him Shadow. The name fit. He moved through the world with a phantom's tread, leaving little trace of his passing. His face, hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat, was lean and weathered, etched with the harsh lines of a life lived on the run. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were in constant motion, scanning the horizon, checking his back trail, missing nothing. He was a man who had learned to live in a state of perpetual vigilance, for to relax was to die. He was hunting his dinner, a scrawny jackrabbit that darted between the sparse, thorny bushes. But even in this simple act of survival, his instincts were honed for a different kind of prey. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of a posse. Every glint of sun on a distant rock looked like the barrel of a rifle. He was the ghost of Trinity Springs, and ghosts, he knew, were meant to be hunted. The nickname Shadow hadn't just been earned by his uncanny ability to disappear. It was born from the dark shadow of the crime that had been pinned to his name, the Trinity Springs bank robbery. A bloody, botched affair that had left the town's beloved old banker Mr. Abernathy dead on the checkered floor. Eli had been there, yes. He'd been trying to make a deposit, the first honest savings of a man trying to leave a rough past behind. The memory was a raw, festering wound, one that time had done little to heal. It came to him in flashes, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass in the eye. The sudden crash of the bank's front window. The masked men, their guns barking fire and death. The look of stunned surprise on Mr. Abernathy's face as he clutched his chest. And Silas Croft, Ollie's partner on the ranch, the man he'd considered a friend, standing over the body, a smoking pistol in his hand, a look of cold, reptilian calculation in his eyes as he pulled off his mask just long enough for the screaming witnesses to see Ellie's face reflected in the window behind him. Silas had taken the money and vanished, leaving Eli to take the blame, to become the focus of the town's grief and rage. Sheriff Brody, a man Eli had respected, had led the posse. He hadn't asked for explanations. He had seen the evidence his eyes had been led to, and had pronounced judgment on the spot. Eli had fled, a bullet from Brody's own rifle grazing his side, the pain a searing reminder of his betrayal. He had become an outlaw, not by choice, but by decree. The $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive, ensured that his life of hiding would also be a life of fighting. He brought down the rabbit with a single, well-aimed shot from his old Colt, the sound shockingly loud in the vast, empty silence. As he cleaned his meager meal, his mind was not on the food, but on the life he had lost. The small ranch he had been building, the tentative friendships he had been forging, the hope for a quiet, honest life, all of it turned to dust, as surely as the dry earth beneath his boots. Trinity Springs had not just cast him out, it had ripped his soul out, leaving a hollow, aching void that no amount of time or distance could fill. He was a ghost, and ghosts are tied to the places that created them. Though he knew it was a fool's errand, his wanderings always kept him within 100 miles of Trinity Springs, a moth drawn to the flame that had so badly burned him. It was this dangerous proximity that led him to the grim discovery. He was following a dry riverbed, a safer route than the open plains, when he saw the buzzards circling. He approached with caution, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. What he found turned the desert heat to ice in his veins. It was the remains of a small wagon train, a family, by the looks of it. The wagon was burned, the supplies looted, the bodies left where they had fallen. This was not the work of opportunistic bandits. This was a massacre, an act of pure, predatory cruelty. And among the wreckage, he found a clue. A single, black feathered arrow, its shaft marked with a distinctive crimson band. He had seen that mark before, in the wanted posters that were his only source of news from the world he'd been forced to leave. It was the sign of the Crimson Marauders, a gang of cutthroats led by a man named Jedediah Kane, a butcher who had carved a path of terror across the territory. They were a plague, a swarm of locusts that descended on a place and left nothing but ruin and death in their wake. And then he saw something else, something that made his blood run even colder. A half-burned piece of a map, clutched in the hand of one of the dead men. It was a map of the region, and there was a single, crudely drawn circle on it. A circle around a town called Trinity Springs. A wave of something, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 5 long years, washed over him. It was not fear. It was a cold, protective rage. The Crimson Marauders were heading for his town. They were heading for the people who had hunted him, the people who had cursed his name, the people who believed he was a monster. He stood there for a long time, the desert wind whipping at his worn clothes, the dying sun casting his long, solitary shadow across the scene of carnage. He had 2 choices, clear and simple as the line between life and death. He could continue to ride, to disappear back into the wilderness, to let the town that had condemned him suffer the fate it had, in a way, earned. He owed them nothing. They had taken everything from him. Or he could turn back. He could ride towards the danger, towards the place that held nothing but bitter memories and the promise of a hangman's rope. He could ride back to save the people who hated him. Why should he care? They had branded him a killer. They had put a price on his head. They had made him a ghost, a shadow. But as he looked at the dead family, at the innocent lives snuffed out by the same kind of senseless violence that had shattered his own, he knew the answer. He was not a killer. He was not the monster they believed him to be. And the only way to prove that, not to them, but to himself, was to do the one thing they would never expect. The ghost was going home. He turned his horse, a tough, resilient Mustang as much an outcast as he was, and faced east, towards Trinity Springs. The journey would be a perilous one. There were bounty hunters who would see his return not as an act of redemption, but as an opportunity. The desert itself was an enemy. And at the end of the road lay a town that would likely shoot him on sight, and a gang of killers who would do the same. The odds were impossible. It was a suicide mission. But for the first time in 5 years, Eli Shadow McGraw was not running from something. He was riding towards it. His past was a ghost that had haunted him across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Now, he would turn and face it, not with explanations or pleas, but with a gun in his hand and a final, desperate act of a redemption he had long since stopped believing was possible. The outlaw's last ride had begun. The decision, once made, settled in Ellie's soul like a stone. It was heavy, illogical, and utterly irreversible. To ride away would have been to accept the label the world had given him, a selfish, godless killer who cared for no one. To ride back was to defy that label, to make a final, desperate stand for the man he had once been, the man Silas Croft had murdered as surely as he had murdered Mr. Abernathy. The memory of Silas was a venom that had poisoned every day of the last 5 years. They had been more than partners, they had been friends. They had shared dreams of building their ranch into something special, of finding peace and prosperity in the unforgiving land. Eli, an orphan who had grown up hard, had allowed himself to trust Silas, to see him as a brother. That trust had been his undoing. The betrayal was a curse, an invisible brand on his soul that burned hotter than any sun. He rode through the night, the moon a cold, silver witness to his mad journey. The unforgivable curse was not just Silas's betrayal, but the town's gullibility. He remembered the faces in the crowd as he'd fled Trinity Springs. Not just anger, but a righteous, terrifying certainty. They had wanted a villain, a simple target for their complex grief, and Silas had served him up on a platter. Sheriff Brody, a man whose sense of justice was as rigid and unyielding as the granite of the nearby mountains, had been the high priest of this new religion, his condemnation absolute. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray, Eli allowed himself a brief rest. He made a small, smokeless fire and brewed a pot of bitter coffee, his mind sorting through the tactical problem ahead. The Crimson Marauders were not just a gang, they were a small, disciplined army. Their leader, Jedediah Kane, was a former cavalry officer who had been court-martialed for brutality during the war. He planned his raids like military campaigns, with scouts, flanking maneuvers, and an utter disregard for civilian life. Trinity Springs, a quiet, peaceful town with a small and experienced sheriff's department would be a lamb to the slaughter. Eli knew he couldn't ride into town and announce his intentions. The bounty on his head was still active. The first man to see him would likely try to collect it. He had to get a message to them, a warning. But who would believe a message from a ghost? He thought of the people he had known. The blacksmith, Mr. Hennessy, a good, solid man. The saloon owner, a woman named Clara, who had always treated him with a gruff but fair kindness. And then he thought of Sarah, Mr. Abernathy's daughter. The memory of Sarah was a different kind of pain, a dull, constant ache of what might have been. They had shared a shy and spoken affection in the months before the robbery. He had dreamed of one day working up the courage to court her properly, of building a life with her. After her father's death, her quiet sorrow had curdled into a fierce and wavering hatred for the man she believed was responsible. Her face, twisted in grief and rage, was one of the last he had seen as he'd fled. To her, he was not just a killer, but the man who had destroyed her world. No, he couldn't go to any of them. He was alone in this. He had to find a way to fight for a town that would offer him no quarter. His journey was a grim testament to the life he now led. On the second day, he spotted the dust cloud behind him. One rider, coming fast. A bounty hunter, no doubt. The vultures were always circling. Eli didn't run. He found a narrow pass between two rock formations and waited. It was a classic ambush spot, the kind of place a hunted man learns to recognize instinctively. He dismounted, taking cover behind a large boulder, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The bounty hunter was a young, eager kid, his face covered in a fine layer of dust and overconfidence. He rode into the pass without hesitation, his eyes scanning the trail ahead, completely oblivious to the danger that lurked just a few feet away. "That's far enough," Eli said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The kid jolted in his saddle, his hand instinctively going for the pistol on his hip. "I wouldn't," Eli advised, his voice dangerously calm. "My rifle has a much longer reach than your pistol, and I'm a much better shot." The kid froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, horrified recognition. You're him," he stammered. "You're McGraw." "Get down from the horse," Eli commanded. Slowly, the bounty hunter complied, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Eli emerged from behind the rock, his Winchester held steady. He kept his distance, his eyes never leaving the young man's. "You're a long way from home, kid," Eli said. "What's your name?" "Cody," the kid mumbled, his eyes fixed on the rifle. "Well, Cody," Eli said, "you've got two choices. You can turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and forget you ever saw me. Or you can try your luck. But I should warn you, the last 3 men who tried their luck are fertilizing the desert floor." Cody swallowed hard, the bravado of the hunt replaced by the cold, hard reality of the prey. "I heard you were heading east," he said, "towards Trinity Springs. The word is out. Every bounty man in the territory is on his way." The news was a cold splash of water in the face. Of course, his return had been noted. He was not just riding towards a gang of killers, he was riding into a hornet's nest of his own making. "Why would I go back to a town that wants to hang me?" Eli asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I don't know," Cody said, shaking his head. "But that's the word. And with the Crimson Marauders also heading that way, well, it's going to be one hell of a party." Eli looked at the young man, at the fear and the greed that warred in his eyes. He saw a reflection of his own younger self, a man drawn to a life of danger without fully understanding its cost. "Give me your gun, Cody," he said. The kid hesitated, his gun his livelihood, his only protection. "The gun," Eli repeated, his voice dropping to a register that left no room for argument. Cody slowly, carefully, unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the dust. Eli motioned with his rifle. "Now get on your horse and ride. And don't look back." The young bounty hunter scrambled onto his horse and kicked it into a gallop, disappearing back the way he had come, a man with a story to tell, but no proof to back it up. Eli retrieved the gun belt, a small but necessary acquisition in the war that was to come. The encounter had sharpened his resolve, but it had also clarified the impossible nature of his task. He was caught between 2 converging storms, the cold, calculated fury of the Crimson Marauders, and the hot, greedy ambition of every bounty hunter in the territory. The unforgivable curse of his past was not just a memory. It was an active, deadly force, a tide that was pulling him towards a violent, inevitable conclusion. He was riding into a crucible, a place where all the ghosts of his past would converge. He remounted his horse and continued his journey east, a man who was no longer just a ghost, but a lightning rod, drawing the full, destructive force of the storm directly to himself. The chances of survival were dwindling with every mile. But for Eli McGraw, survival was no longer the primary objective. Redemption was. And he knew, with a certainty that was as bleak and as beautiful as the desert sunrise, that the price of redemption would be paid in blood. The desert was a formidable enemy, a patient, indifferent killer. The sun was a relentless eye in a bleached white sky, sucking the moisture from the land and from the man who dared to cross it. The nights were a deceptive relief, the temperature plummeting to a biting cold, the silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. Eli moved through this landscape not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant, respecting its power, understanding its rhythms. He was a ghost, and the desert was a fitting purgatory. His encounter with the young bounty hunter Cody had been a stark reminder that the human dangers of his journey were just as potent as the natural ones. The word was out. He was a fox, running back towards the hounds, and every man with a gun and a taste for blood money was now a part of the hunt. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than all of them. He abandoned the more direct trails, pushing deeper into the inhospitable wilderness, a land of jagged canyons and treacherous rockfalls that most men were wise enough to avoid. It was a slower, more arduous route, but it was also a safer one. He was in his element here. He could read the land like a book, finding hidden sources of water, tracking the movements of the desert creatures, using the harsh and forgiving terrain as his shield. The journey was a crucible that burned away the last vestiges of the man he had once dreamed of being. The quiet rancher, the hopeful suitor, the respected member of a community, all of them were ghosts, phantoms of a life that had been stolen from him. What was left was the man the world had made him, the survivor, the fighter, the shadow. On the fourth day of his journey, he found proof that he was not alone in this desolate landscape. He came across a recently abandoned campsite, the embers of the fire still warm. There were tracks of 3 horses, and the careless, wasteful way the camp had been left, a half-eaten can of beans, a discarded cheroot, spoke of men who were not at home in the wilderness. Amateurs. Or worse, men who were so confident in their own abilities that they had grown sloppy. He followed the tracks, his movements as silent and as cautious as a stalking wolf. He found them a few miles ahead, resting their horses in the thin shade of a rocky overhang. They were classic bounty hunters, hard-faced men with greedy eyes and guns that had seen to much use. He recognized one of them from a wanted poster he'd seen years ago, a man named Grizzly Gus, known for bringing his bounties back in pieces rather than as a whole. Eli watched them from a ridge, his Winchester a comforting weight in his hands. He could have ambushed them, taken them out one by one, a ghost reaping a grim harvest in the desert. The man he had become was certainly capable of it. But the man he was fighting to be, the man who was riding to save a town, hesitated. To kill these men, even in self-defense, would be to become the monster that Trinity Springs already believed him to be. It would be a betrayal of the very purpose of his journey. He decided to circumvent them, a long, difficult detour that would cost him precious time. But as he was about to move, he overheard a snatch of their conversation, their voices carrying on the thin, dry air. "Don't see why we're in such a hurry," one of them grumbled. "The 500 for McGraw is good money, but the real prize is the town itself." "Kane pays better," Grizzly Gus growled. "He's offering a share of the whole damn town to any man who signs on with him before the raid. Says he's going to turn it into his own private kingdom. We get there, we join up, we get rich. If we happen to run into McGraw along the way, that's just a bonus." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. The situation was worse than he had imagined. Kane wasn't just planning a raid, he was planning an occupation. He was recruiting every piece of human scum in the territory, swelling his ranks, turning his gang into an unstoppable force. And men like these, men motivated only by greed, were flocking to his banner. The detour was no longer an option. He was in a race against time, a race he could not afford to lose. And these 3 men were now not just a threat to him, they were a threat to Trinity Springs. They were reinforcements for the enemy. His choice was made for him. This was not murder. This was war. He waited until they were mounted up and on the move again. He let them ride into a narrow, winding canyon, the high rock walls echoing the sound of their horses' hooves. Then, from a position high above them, he made his move. He did not fire at the men. He fired at the rock face just above them. The bullet from his Winchester struck the brittle, sun-baked stone, and a shower of pebbles and dust rained down on the trail. The bounty hunters reined in their horses, their heads snapping up, their eyes searching the canyon walls. "What the hell was that?" one of them shouted. Before they could react, Eli fired again, this time at a large, precariously balanced boulder on the opposite side of the canyon. The boulder shuddered, dislodged from its ancient perch, and then began to fall. It triggered an avalanche. A river of rock and sand poured down the canyon wall, a thunderous, unstoppable force that crashed onto the trail in front of them, blocking their path completely. Their horses, spooked by the noise and the falling rock, reared and whinnied in terror. In the confusion, Eli made his move. He scrambled down a hidden, game trail, emerging onto the canyon floor behind them, his Colt now in his hand. "Drop them," he commanded, his voice echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. The three men spun around, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Grizzly Gus, his hand hovering over his gun, stared at Eli, his eyes narrowing in recognition and a dawning, terrible understanding. "You're McGraw," he growled. "I am," Eli said. "And this is as far as you go." Gus, true to his reputation, was not a man to be taken alive. He went for his gun. He was fast, but he was facing a legend. Eli's shot was a single, definitive statement that ended the man's career and his life. The other two, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They dropped their gun belts to the ground, their hands raised high in the air. Eli disarmed them, his movements quick, efficient. He looked at the two terrified men, their greed now replaced by a desperate, pathetic fear. He was not a cold-blooded killer. He could not bring himself to shoot two unarmed men. "Take what supplies you can carry and start walking," he said, his voice as hard and as unforgiving as the rock that surrounded them. "Your horses are mine now. Walk," one of them whined. "It's 50 miles to the nearest town. We'll die out here." "You should have thought of that before you threw in with a man like Cain," Eli said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Now get moving. And if I ever see either of you again, I won't be in such a charitable mood." He watched them scramble away, to pathetic figures in the vast, indifferent landscape. He had their horses now, a string of fresh mounts that would allow him to travel faster, to make up for lost time. But the cost had been high. He had taken a life, the first in a long time. The ghost of Grizzly Gus would now be added to the collection that haunted his soul. He led the horses out of the canyon, his face a grim, stony mask. The journey home was changing him, forcing him to become the very thing he had been accused of being. He was a man caught in a terrible, bloody paradox. To save the town that believed he was a monster, he had to become a monster. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the killing was not over. It had only just begun. The shadow was casting a long, dark trail of its own, and it was a trail that was leading, inevitably, to a final, bloody confrontation in the streets of the town that had created him. After 6 days of hard riding, Eli finally saw it. Trinity Springs. Nestled in a valley carved by a river that was its lifeblood, the town was a splash of green and brown against the muted colors of the surrounding plains. From his vantage point on a high ridge, it looked deceptively peaceful, a picture of tranquility that belied the storm that was about to break over it. He spent the rest of the day observing the town, a ghost on its own doorstep. He watched the comings and goings of the townspeople, the familiar rhythms of a life he had once been a part of. He saw Mr. Hennessy at his forge, the sparks flying from his hammer, a reassuringly constant sight. He saw children playing in the street, their laughter carrying on the wind, a sound that was both beautiful and painful to his ears. And he saw Sheriff Brody. The man was a pillar of salt, rigid and unmoving, his face a mask of grim authority. He patrolled the town with a heavy, deliberate tread, his hand never far from the butt of his gun. Brody had aged in the last 5 years, the lines on his face deeper, his hair a shade grayer, but the look in his eyes, a look of unwavering, uncompromising certainty, was the same. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, and Eli McGraw was, and would forever be, the darkest shade of black. As dusk began to settle, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, Eli saw the first signs of the fear that was gripping the town. The streets emptied earlier than usual. The doors were bolted, the windows shuttered. A palpable tension hung in the air, a sense of a community holding its collective breath. They knew the Crimson Marauders were coming. The whispers had reached them. Eli knew he couldn't stay on the ridge. He had to get into the town, to gather information, to understand the lay of the land. He was a shadow, and it was time to embrace the darkness. He waited until the moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. Then he made his move. He left his horses in a hidden copse of trees and approached the town on foot, his movements as silent and as fluid as the river that ran beside it. He slipped into the town through the back alleys, the familiar paths of his youth now a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The town he had known was still there, but it was overlaid with a new, more sinister atmosphere. He could feel the fear. It was in the way a dog would bark at a passing shadow, in the way a curtain would twitch in a darkened window. He needed an ally, a source of information, one person who might be willing to listen to a ghost. There was only one person he could think of, one person who had always possessed a quiet, thoughtful intelligence that set her apart from the rest of the town. Sarah Abernathy. It was a terrible risk. She, more than anyone, had reason to hate him. But she was also the key. Her father had been the heart of the town, and she, in many ways, had taken his place. She ran the general store now, and she would know the town's pulse, its fears, its strengths, and its weaknesses. He found the store, a dark, silent building on the main street. He moved to the back, to the small apartment where she lived. A single light burned in the window. He picked up a small pebble and tossed it against the glass, a soft, barely audible click. He waited. After a moment, the curtain moved, and he saw her silhouette. He tossed another pebble. The back door opened a crack, and she peered out, a shotgun held steady in her hands. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a low, tense whisper. Eli stepped out of the shadows, his hands held up, open and empty. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, rusty sound. "It's me, Eli." The color drained from her face. The look in her eyes was a chaotic mixture of shock, fear, and a deep, simmering hatred that had not diminished with time. The barrel of the shotgun did not waver. "You," she breathed, the single word filled with 5 years of pain and anger. "You have some nerve, coming back here." "I know," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Sarah. I'm here to help." "Help," she scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "The last time you were here, you helped my father into an early grave." "It wasn't me, Sarah," he said, the old, futile words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It was Silas Croft. He framed me." "I don't believe you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Get out of here, Eli, before I call the sheriff." "The Crimson Marauders are coming, Sarah," he said, his voice urgent now. "Jedediah Kane and his men. They're not just coming to rob the town. They're coming to take it, to burn it to the ground. I saw what they did to a family on the trail. They're butchers." She hesitated, the certainty in her eyes wavering for the first time. The town had been filled with rumors, whispers of the marauders' approach. But to hear it confirmed, to hear it from him, gave it a new, more terrifying reality. "Even if that's true," she said, her voice a little less certain, "what makes you think you can do anything about it? And why would you want to?" "Because this was my home once," he said, his voice filled with a raw, honest emotion that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Because no matter what you or anyone else in this town thinks of me, I am not a man who stands by and watches innocent people die." He looked at her, at the woman she had become. The soft, gentle girl he had known was gone, replaced by a woman of strength and resolve, her grief a forge that had tempered her into steel. "I don't need you to believe me about the past, Sarah," he said. "I just need you to believe me about the future. This town is in terrible danger, and I'm the only one who knows how to fight men like Kane." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between her long-held hatred and the undeniable truth of his words. He was her father's killer, but he might also be their only hope. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the shotgun lowering a few inches. "Information," he said. How many men does Sheriff Brody have? What kind of preparations has he made? What's the mood of the townspeople? She stared at him for a long, silent moment, the fate of the town hanging in the balance of her decision. To trust him would be to betray the memory of her father. To turn him away could be to condemn them all. "Meet me here in 1 hour," she said, her voice a low, clipped command. "Don't be seen." She closed the door, leaving him alone in the darkness. It was not an absolution. It was not forgiveness. But it was a chance. A single, fragile thread of trust in a town that was held together by whispers and fear. For the ghost of Trinity Springs, it was more than he had dared to hope for. The hour that followed was one of the longest of Ellie's life. He melted back into the shadows of the alleyways, his senses on high alert. He was a trespasser in his own past, a ghost walking the familiar but hostile streets of his hometown. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant cough, was a potential threat. He was a spark in a tinderbox, and the slightest misstep could set the whole town ablaze. He used the time to his advantage, moving through the town like a phantom, his old knowledge of its hidden corners and secret paths serving him well. He was reacquainting himself with the terrain, not as a resident, but as a soldier. He noted the strategic advantages of certain buildings, the potential ambush points, the vulnerable and defended approaches to the town. He was seeing Trinity Springs not as a home, but as a battlefield. He saw the town's pathetic attempts at a defense. A few hastily constructed barricades at either end of the main street, made from old wagons and barrels. They were flimsy, poorly designed, more of a psychological comfort than a real obstacle. He saw armed men on the rooftops, but they were silhouetted against the night sky, perfect targets for any competent marksman. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but he was a lawman, not a military commander. He was preparing for a gunfight, not a war. The town was a lamb, waiting for the slaughter, and the weight of that knowledge settled heavily on Ellie's shoulders. His personal quest for redemption had become something much larger, much more urgent. It was now a race to save the lives of hundreds of people who would not hesitate to put a rope around his neck. He made his way back to the rear of the general store. They were almost up. The back door opened a crack, and Sarah's hand emerged, beckoning him inside. He slipped into the small, dark storage room, the scent of canvas, coffee beans, and dried apples a sudden, disorienting wave of nostalgia. Sarah closed and bolted the door behind him. She was holding a lantern, its low, flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls and on her pale, tense face. "This is insane," she whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and a grudging, defiant courage. "If anyone finds you here, they won't," he said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "I've been a ghost for 5 years, Sarah. I've gotten good at it." She led him into the small, neat living quarters behind the store. It was her home, her sanctuary, and he was a viper she had just invited into it. The irony was not lost on him. "Tell me what you know," he said, his voice all business, pushing aside the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "The town is terrified," she said, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the facts. "Sheriff Brody has deputized a dozen men. Most of them are shopkeepers and ranchers. They can handle a gun, but they're not fighters. Not like what's coming." "How many men does Brody have in total?" he asked. 15, including himself and his 2 regular deputies," she said. "One of his deputies is just a boy, barely 20. 15 green men against Kane's army of seasoned killers." The odds were even worse than he had imagined. "What about weapons?" he asked. "We have what's in the store," she said, gesturing to a locked cabinet against the wall. "A dozen new Winchesters, a few shotguns, and plenty of ammunition. Brody has already distributed most of it." "It won't be enough," he said, his voice a grim, flat statement. "Not in a straight fight. Kane will roll over them like a flood." He began to pace the small room, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. "We can't fight them head-on," he said, more to himself than to her. "We have to be smarter. We have to use the town itself as a weapon. We have to turn their strength, their numbers, against them." Sarah watched him, her expression a mixture of fear and a dawning, grudging respect. This was not the man she remembered, the quiet, gentle rancher who had been accused of a brutal crime. This was someone else, a man with a cold, hard, and terrifyingly competent mind. This was the man who had survived for 5 years as a hunted ghost. "What are you planning, Eli?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped his pacing and looked at her, his stormy eyes intense in the lamplight. "I'm planning a reception for Mr. Kane," he said, a humorless smile twisting his lips. "I'm going to turn this town into a meat grinder. I'm going to make him pay for every foot of ground he tries to take." He began to lay out his plan, his voice low, urgent. He spoke of turning the narrow streets into kill zones, of using the buildings for enfilading fire, of setting traps, of creating diversions. He spoke the language of a man who had been forged in the crucible of 100 desperate, life-or-death struggles. Sarah listened, mesmerized, her long-held hatred for him slowly, reluctantly, being replaced by a new, more complicated emotion. She had spent 5 years believing he was a monster, a simple, brutish killer. But the man standing before her was not a monster. He was a soldier, a strategist, a man who was using his dark, hard-won knowledge not for his own gain, but to save the very people who had condemned him. "It's a good plan," she said, her voice filled with a new and certain respect. "But it will never work. Sheriff Brody will never listen to you. He'd sooner put you in a cell than take orders from you." "I know," Eli said. "That's why you have to be the one to convince him." "Me?" she asked, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Yes," he said, his gaze unwavering. "He'll listen to you. You're Abernathy's daughter. You're the conscience of this town. You have to go to him. You have to tell him this plan is yours. You have to make him believe that he has no other choice." He was asking the impossible. He was asking her to lie to the sheriff, to become a conspirator with the man she had sworn to hate. He was asking her to risk everything, her reputation, her safety, her very place in the community, on the word of a ghost. "Why are you doing this, Eli?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her since he had first appeared in her backyard. "After everything this town has done to you, why?" He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the hard, cold mask of the gunslinger slipped, and she saw the man beneath, the man she had once, almost, allowed herself to care for. "Because someone has to," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "And because, no matter what this town thinks of me, I have to be able to live with myself. And I can't do that if I let them all die." He turned to leave. "You have to decide, Sarah," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "The fate of this town is in your hands now." He slipped out the back door and disappeared into the night, leaving her alone with his words, his plan, and a choice that would change the course of her life, and the destiny of Trinity Springs, forever. The shadow had planted a seed of hope in the heart of the darkness. Now, he could only pray that it would be allowed to grow. The night was long and filled with a tense, waiting silence. Eli found a hiding spot in the hayloft of the abandoned livery stable, a place that offered a commanding view of the main street and a dozen different escape routes. He did not sleep. He watched, he listened, and he waited for Sarah's decision. The fate of Trinity Springs rested on the shoulders of a woman who had every reason to want him dead. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. Just before dawn, he saw a light appear in the window of the sheriff's office. A few minutes later, the door to the general store opened, and Sarah, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, slipped out and hurried across the deserted street. She knocked on the sheriff's door, and after a moment, she was let inside. The wait was in agony. Eli imagined the scene inside the office. Sarah, her voice trembling but firm, trying to convince the most stubborn man in the territory to listen to reason. And Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of granite, his mind a closed book, listening to the daughter of the man he believed Eli had murdered, as she proposed a radical, unconventional plan of defense. An hour passed. The sun began to rise, its first, tentative rays illuminating the empty street. The door to the sheriff's office opened, and Sarah emerged, her face pale and drawn in the morning light. She did not look towards the livery stable. She simply walked back to her store and disappeared inside. Eli didn't know what to think. Had she succeeded? Had she failed? Or had she betrayed him, revealing his presence to Brody, a final, vengeful act against the man who had destroyed her family? He was a ghost in her town, and she held the power to exorcise him with a single word. He didn't have to wait long for his answer. A few minutes later, Sheriff Brody emerged from his office. He stood on the boardwalk, his gaze sweeping over the town, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. He looked towards the livery stable, his eyes seeming to pierce the shadows of the hayloft, to fix directly on Ali's hiding place. Ali's hand went to his own gun. This was it. The confrontation he had known was inevitable. But Brody did not draw his weapon. He simply nodded, a single, almost imperceptible gesture. Then he turned and began to shout orders to his deputies, his voice ringing with a new, urgent authority. And the orders he was shouting were not his own. They were Ellie's. He was telling them to dismantle the useless barricades, to gather barrels and fill them with water, to move the new Winchesters to the second-story windows of the hotel and the saloon. He was turning Trinity Springs into a fortress, just as Eli had planned. Sarah had done it. She had convinced him. She had chosen to trust the ghost. A wave of relief, so profound it almost made him weak, washed over Eli. But it was quickly followed by a cold reality. The plan was in motion, but it was still being executed by amateurs. Brody was a good soldier, but he didn't have the mind of a guerrilla fighter. He needed a guide, a shadow to whisper in his ear. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Eli made his move. He slipped out of the livery stable and made his way to the back of the sheriff's office. The rear window was unlocked, just as he had hoped. Brody was a man of routine, and some habits died hard. He slid the window open and slipped inside, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. Brody was sitting at his desk, a map of the town spread out before him, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow. He was not a drinking man, and the bottle was a testament to the strain he was under. He did not seem surprised to see Eli. He just looked up, his eyes weary, his face a mask of a deep, profound conflict. "You," Brody said, his voice a low, tired growl. "I should have known you wouldn't stay in the shadows." "You're doing it wrong," Eli said, ignoring the implicit threat. He pointed to the map. "Your men on the hotel roof are too exposed. And you've left the south approach to the town completely undefended." Brody stared at him, his hand resting on the gun on his desk. "I should arrest you right now, McGraw. I should put you in that cell and throw away the key." "You could," Eli said, his voice calm, reasonable. "And then you could watch Jedediah Kane and his men burn your town to the ground and slaughter every man, woman, and child in it. Your choice, Sheriff." The two men locked gazes, a silent, titanic struggle of wills. On one side was Brody, the embodiment of the law, a man whose entire world was built on a foundation of order and a rigid, unshakable sense of right and wrong. On the other was Eli, the outlaw, the ghost, a man who had been forced to live outside the law, to make his own rules, to survive in a world of chaos. "Sarah Abernathy believes in you," Brody said, his voice a low, grudging admission. "She says you're not the man I think you are." "Does it matter what kind of man I am?" Eli countered. "The only thing that matters right now is that I know how to kill men like Kane. And you don't." Brody was silent for a long, agonizing moment. The battle between his duty as a lawman and his responsibility as a protector of the town was raging in his soul. To ally himself with Eli was to betray every principle he had ever held. But to refuse his help would be to condemn his town to certain death. "What do you suggest?" Brody finally asked, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. It was a surrender, a capitulation, a recognition that the black and white world he had lived in was no longer adequate to deal with the shades of gray that were descending upon them. For the next hour, the two men, the lawman and the outlaw, the hunter and the hunted, bent over the map, their heads close together. Eli, with the knowledge born of 5 years of desperate survival, pointed out the weaknesses in the town's defenses, the tactical advantages of the terrain. He spoke of turning the general store into a fortified strongpoint, of creating a hidden escape route through the old mine tunnels that ran beneath the town, of setting a fire trap in the livery stable. Brody listened, his initial hostility slowly, reluctantly, giving way to a grudging respect. He was a good man, a brave man, but he was out of his depth. And he knew it. "This is a desperate plan, McGraw," he said, when Eli had finished. "We're in a desperate situation, Sheriff," Eli replied. Brody looked at him, at the ghost who had come back to save them. "You do this," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "You help us save this town, and I will personally tear up that wanted poster. I'll clear your name." "I'm not doing this for my name, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice quiet, but firm. "I'm doing this for the town." A new, and likely, and deeply secret alliance had been forged in the dead of night, an alliance between two mortal enemies, united by a common threat. The ghosts now had a foothold in the world of the living. But as the two men prepared for the coming storm, they both knew that even with their combined strength, the odds were still impossibly long. The Crimson Marauders were coming, and they were bringing hell with them. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. By day, Sheriff Brody was the public face of the town's defense, his deputies and the newly minted civilian militia carrying out his orders with a newfound sense of purpose. But by night, the true commander of Trinity Springs emerged from the shadows. Eli became a nocturnal phantom, moving through the darkened streets, his face hidden by the night, his presence known only to the people, the sheriff who had sworn to capture him, and the woman who had sworn to hate him. It was a strange, tense triumvirate, a secret council of war held in the back room of the general store, the air thick with the scent of coffee and unspoken weight of their shared, complicated history. Under Ellie's guidance, the town's defenses were transformed. The flimsy barricades were reinforced, rebuilt not just as obstacles, but as fortified fighting positions, with carefully placed firing slits and overlapping fields of fire. The second-story windows of the key building, saloon, the hotel, the general store itself returned into snipers' nests, manned by the town's best marksmen. Ellie's strategy was not to stop the marauders at the edge of town, but to lure them in, to draw them into a series of carefully prepared traps. The main street, he explained, would be their graveyard. He worked with a cold, detached efficiency that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying to watch. He showed Mr. Hennessy, the blacksmith, how to rig a tripwire that would drop a heavy iron gate, trapping a portion of the raiding party. He instructed a group of ranchers on how to create a fire trap in the livery stable, using barrels of oil and a simple, delayed fuse. He walked every inch of the town with Brody, pointing out the blind spots, the hidden alleys, the secret ways that a man could move unseen. He was teaching the lawmen how to think like an outlaw. Brody, to his credit, swallowed his pride and listened. He saw the grim, undeniable logic in Ellie's plans, the brutal efficiency of a mind that had been honed by years of life-or-death struggle. The sheriff began to see Eli not as the monster he had hunted, but as a weapon, a dangerous, unpredictable weapon that he had no choice but to wield. Sarah was the crucial link between them, the bridge across the chasm of their mutual distrust. She became the quartermaster of their small, desperate army, distributing weapons and ammunition, organizing the women to prepare food and medical supplies. She moved through the town with a quiet, determined grace, her presence a calming influence on the terrified townspeople. Her feelings towards Eli were a tangled, chaotic mess. She watched him work, saw the strategic brilliance, the quiet competence, the unwavering focus. This was not the act of a guilty man. This was the act of a protector, a guardian. The hard shell of her hatred, so carefully constructed over 5 long years, was beginning to crack, and the woman beneath, the woman who had once seen a quiet goodness in Eli McGraw, was beginning to emerge. One night, as they were going over the final details of the plan, she found him alone, cleaning his Winchester, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a single lantern. "You never told me how you knew it was Silas," she said, her voice soft. He didn't look up from his work. "There were 3 of us at the ranch," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Silas, me, and a young hand named Billy. The day before the robbery, Silas sent Billy on an errand to the next county, an errand that should have taken him half a day. He didn't come back for 3. He came back after I was gone, after my name was Mud." He paused, the memory still a raw, open wound. The men who robbed the bank were professionals. They moved fast, they knew the layout. Someone had to have given them the information. And Silas was a gambler. He was deep in debt to some very dangerous men. He needed money, and he needed it fast. He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. "But none of that is proof. It's just the story of a man who was betrayed by his best friend. The only thing I can prove is that I'm not the man who killed your father." He looked away, his gaze distant. "I liked your father, Sarah. He was a good man. He was the first person in this town who treated me like I was something more than just a hired gun with a shady past. He loaned me the money to start my ranch. He believed in me." The confession, so simple, so filled with a quiet, unadorned pain, was more powerful than any denial. In that moment, the last of Sarah's doubt washed away. She had been wrong. They had all been wrong. They had condemned an innocent man, and in doing so, they had unleashed the real monster, Silas Croft, upon the world. "I believe you, Eli," she whispered, the words a quiet, momentous absolution. He looked at her, a flicker of something, a long-forgotten hope, in his eyes. But before he could speak, the sound they had all been dreading echoed from the hills outside the town. A single gunshot, the signal from the scout they had posted on the ridge. The Crimson Marauders were here. The town, which had been a hive of frantic preparation, suddenly fell silent. A new, more profound, and more terrifying stillness descended. The time for planning was over. The time for fighting had begun. Eli, Sarah, and Brody looked at each other, the unlikely alliance of the ghost, the conscience, and the law. They were as ready as they would ever be. "Get to your posts," Brody commanded, his voice a low, steady growl. Sarah gave Eli one last, long look, a look that was filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Then she picked up a rifle and headed for her position in the window of the store. Eli and Brody were the last ones in the room. "This is it, McGraw," the sheriff said. "This is it," Eli agreed. He pulled his hat down low, checked the action on his Colt, and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the shadows he called home. He was not just fighting for a town anymore. He was fighting for the memory of a good man he had admired, and for the belief of a woman he had, against all odds, come to respect. The shadow was about to go to war. The silence that followed the scout's warning shot was a taut, stretched wire, humming with a terrifying, silent energy. The moon, a cold, indifferent observer, climbed higher in the sky, bathing the deserted main street of Trinity Springs in an eerie, silver light. From their hidden positions, the defenders of the town waited, their knuckles white on their rifles, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. Eli was perched in the bell tower of the town's small church, a position that gave him a commanding view of the entire battlefield. He was a ghost in the rafters, an unseen, avenging angel looking down on the stage where the final act of his redemption, or his damnation, would be played out. They came not with a wild, chaotic charge, but with a disciplined, military precision that was far more terrifying. Jedediah Kane was a professional. His men, at least 30 of them, advanced on foot, using the shadows of the buildings for cover, their movements coordinated, efficient. They were a pack of wolves, testing the defenses, looking for a weakness. Eli watched them through the sights of his Winchester, his breath slow, steady. He held his fire. The first shot had to be the signal, the first note in a symphony of destruction. Kane's men reached the edge of the town, their overconfidence palpable. They saw the deserted street, the shuttered windows, and they thought the town was cowering in fear. One of them, a big, burly man with a thick beard, laughed and kicked open the door to the blacksmith shop. That was the signal. Ellie's Winchester cracked, the sound a sharp, definitive statement in the silent night. The big man was thrown backwards, a neat, black hole in his chest, his laughter cut short in a final, surprised gurgle. The town erupted. From a dozen hidden windows, a fusillade of gunfire ripped through the night. Two more of Kane's men fell before they even knew what was happening. The rest stepped for cover, their surprise turning to a furious, panicked rage. The battle for Trinity Springs had begun. The Marauders returned fire, a wild, indiscriminate hail of lead that tore into the wooden facades of the buildings, sending splinters flying. But they were firing at ghosts. The defenders, well hidden, well protected, picked their shots, their fire coordinated, accurate. Eli was a conductor, orchestrating the battle from his perch in the bell tower. He was not just a fighter, he was a commander. He saw a group of marauders trying to flank the saloon, and a single, well-placed shot from his rifle kicked up the dust at their feet, forcing them back. He saw a sniper setting up in a window across the street, and he put a bullet through the man's scope before he could fire a single shot. The initial assault was repulsed. The marauders fell back, dragging their wounded with them, leaving their dead behind in the dusty street. A ragged, triumphant cheer went up from the defenders. They had drawn first blood. But Eli knew this was just the beginning. Kane was testing them. The next wave would be harder, more brutal. It came 10 minutes later. This time, they charged, a screaming, yelling horde, their guns blazing, a wave of pure, unrestrained violence designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer ferocity. They ran straight into Ollie's traps. A group of them charged the livery stable, intending to use it as a fortified position. They kicked open the doors and ran inside, only to be met by the fire trap. A delayed fuse, ignited by the opening of the doors, reached the barrels of oil. The stable erupted in a massive, fiery explosion, a man-made volcano that consumed the men inside and turned the building into a blazing inferno. Another group, charging down the main street, ran into the tripwire. The heavy iron gate that Hennessy had rigged crashed down, trapping a half-dozen of them in a narrow, inescapable kill zone. The riflemen in the surrounding buildings opened up, and the trapped men were cut down in a merciless crossfire. The charge faltered, the wave of violence breaking against the rocks of Ellie's carefully prepared defenses. The Marauders were no longer a disciplined army, they were a disorganized, terrified mob. But Jedediah Kane was not a man to be easily defeated. From the shadows at the edge of town, he rallied his men, his voice a furious, bellowing roar. He was a force of pure, malevolent will, and he would not accept defeat. He spotted the source of the town's coordinated defense, the flashes of gunfire from the church bell tower. He had found the ghost. The church, he roared, pointing with his saber. Take the church. Kill the man in the tower. A dozen of his men broke off from the main group and charged the church, their faces masks of grim determination. Eli saw them coming. He was trapped, his position now a liability rather than an asset. He fired as they came, his Winchester a steady, barking rhythm of death. 3 of them fell, but the rest kept coming, a relentless, unstoppable tide. He fired until his rifle was empty, then drew his Colt. They were at the doors of the church now, their boots thundering on the wooden steps. They burst inside, their guns blazing, the sacred space of the church defiled by their violent intrusion. Eli knew he couldn't stay in the tower. He was a rat in a trap. He swung down from the bell rope, landing in a crouch on the balcony below, just as a hail of bullets tore through the floor of the belfry. He had to get out. He ran along the balcony, the Marauders below him firing up at him, their shots splintering the wooden railing. He reached the back of the church, where a high, stained glass window depicted a serene, pastoral scene. With no other choice, he kicked it out, the beautiful, colored glass exploding outwards in a shower of deadly, glittering shards. He leaped through the empty frame, tucking and rolling as he hit the ground, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He came up shooting, his Colt bucking in his hand, a ghost who had refused to be exorcised. The battle was far from over, and he was now in the heart of the storm, a lone man against a sea of killers, his own personal siege having just begun. Eli landed hard in the church graveyard, the cold, silent tombstones his only allies. The Marauders poured out of the church, their shouts of triumph turning to cries of rage as they saw him, alive and fighting. He was no longer a sniper in a tower, he was a cornered wolf, and he was at his most dangerous. He used the graveyard to his advantage, the tombstones providing a chaotic, unpredictable field of cover. He moved between them with a spectral grace, his Colt a blur of motion, each shot a carefully considered and fatal decision. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a single man holding back a tide of chaos. But he was just one man. He was outnumbered, and they were closing in, their fire becoming more accurate, more concentrated. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt, another ricocheted off the tombstone he was hiding behind, sending a spray of granite chips into his face. He was running out of time, and he was running out of bullets. Suddenly, a new wave of gunfire erupted from the street, not at him, but at his attackers. Sheriff Brody, his face a grim mask of determination, was leading a charge out of the sheriff's office, his 2 deputies and a half-dozen of the town's bravest men at his side. They had seen his plight, had seen the Marauders concentrating their forces on the church, and they had made a decision. They were no longer just defenders, they were attackers. They were coming to save the ghost. The surprise counterattack threw the Marauders into confusion. They were caught in a crossfire, between Eli in the graveyard and Brody's men in the street. Their disciplined assault dissolved into a panicked, every man for himself scramble for cover. The tide of the battle had turned. Jedediah Kane, watching his army disintegrate, let out a roar of pure, animalistic fury. His plan was in ruins, his men were being slaughtered. He saw Brody, the symbol of the town's defiance, and his rage found a focus. With a blood-curdling yell, he charged, his saber held high, a one-man army of hate and destruction. Brody saw him coming. He raised his pistol to fire, but it clicked on an empty chamber. He fumbled to reload, but Cain was too fast. The saber sliced down, and Brody cried out in pain, his pistol clattering to the ground as the blade cut a deep gash in his arm. Cain raised the saber for the killing blow, a triumphant, demonic grin on his face. But he never delivered it. A single shot rang out, and Cain stumbled, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He looked down at his chest, where a dark, spreading stain was appearing on his shirt. He looked up and saw Eli, standing at the edge of the graveyard, his Colt held steady, smoke curling from its barrel. Cain's grin turned into a snarl of pure hatred. He had been defeated, not by an army, but by a ghost. With a final, defiant curse, he collapsed into the dust, the heart of the storm finally, irrevocably, stilled. The remaining marauders, seeing their leader fall, lost what little nerve they had left. They broke and ran, a panicked, disorganized rabble, fleeing into the darkness, leaving their dead and their dreams of conquest behind them. A sudden, ringing silence fell over the town, broken only by the crackle of the burning livery stable and the groans of the wounded. The battle was over. Trinity Springs was still standing. Eli walked out of the graveyard, his gun hanging limply at his side, the adrenaline of the fight draining away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of relief, shock, and a dawning, awestruck understanding. They looked at the carnage in the street, at the dead marauders, at their wounded sheriff. And then they looked at him, at the ghost, the outlaw, the man they had hunted, the man who had just saved them all. Sheriff Brody, clutching his wounded arm, walked over to Eli. He stood before him, the two men, the lawman and the outlaw, facing each other in the center of the town they had together saved. Brody looked at Eli, at the weariness in his eyes, at the quiet, unassuming way he held himself. This was not the monster he had imagined, not the cold-blooded killer he had hunted for 5 long years. This was a man who had been wronged, and who had, against all odds, chosen to do right. Without a word, Brody reached up to the wall of his office and tore down the wanted poster, the one that had defined Ellie's life for so long. He tore it into pieces and let them fall to the dust, a quiet, symbolic act of absolution. Sarah ran out of the store, her face streaked with soot and tears. She ran to Eli, and without hesitation, she threw her arms around him, a gesture of gratitude, of belief, of a forgiveness that was more powerful than any official pardon. Eli stood there, in the heart of the town that had cast him out, surrounded by the people who now saw him not as a shadow, but as a hero. He had faced the heart of the storm, and he had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. The outlaw's last ride had ended not in a blaze of glory, or at the end of a rope, but here, in a quiet, profound moment of redemption. The sunrise that broke over Trinity Springs was the most beautiful Eli had ever seen. It painted the sky in soft, hopeful shades of pink and gold, its gentle light washing over a town that was battered, bruised, but unbroken. The air, thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, was slowly clearing, replaced by the clean, crisp scent of a new day. The cost of their victory had been high. The town had lost for good men, and nearly a dozen more were wounded. The livery stable was a smoking ruin, and almost every building on the main street was pockmarked with bullet holes. But they had survived. They had faced the storm and had held their ground. Eli had spent the rest of the night helping, not as a ghost, but as a member of the community. He had helped carry the wounded to the makeshift infirmary that Sarah had set up in the town hall. He had helped put out the last of the fires. He had worked alongside the very men who, just a day before, would have shot him on sight. There were no words of thanks, not at first. Just quiet nods of respect, offers of a cup of coffee, a shared, silent understanding that something profound had shifted in the soul of their town. The old certainties had been washed away in a tide of blood and fire, and in their place, something new, something more honest, was beginning to grow. As the sun climbed higher, Sheriff Brody, his arm in a sling, his face pale but resolute, found Eli sitting on the steps of the general store. "The circuit judge is due in a week," Brody said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I've already sent a rider to meet him. I'll give him my full report. I'll tell him what you did here. And I'll tell him what I now know to be the truth about the bank robbery." He paused, the words of apology not coming easily to a man like him. "I was wrong, McGraw. I was wrong about you. You were a man doing your job, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice quiet, devoid of any bitterness. "You followed the evidence you were given." "I should have looked harder," Brody said, a note of deep, personal regret in his voice. "I should have known you weren't capable of that." He looked out at the town, at the people who were already beginning to clear away the wreckage, to rebuild what had been broken. "This town owes you a debt it can never repay." "This town doesn't owe me anything," Eli said. He looked at Brody, his gaze clear and steady. "But I'll need a signed pardon from that judge. A piece of paper that says I'm a free man." "You'll have it," Brody promised. "And then what? Will you stay?" "The offer to help you rebuild your ranch still stands." Eli was silent for a long moment. He looked at the town, at the faces of the people who now looked at him with respect and gratitude. He looked at the door of the general store, and thought of the woman inside, the woman who had, in her own way, saved him as much as he had saved her. He could stay. He could have the life he had once dreamed of. But he knew, with a certainty that was both sad and freeing, that he couldn't. The ghost had been laid to rest, but the shadow remained. He had been forged into something new in the crucible of the last 5 years, something that no longer fit in this quiet, peaceful valley. He had found his redemption, but he had not found his home. "I'm a drifter, Sheriff," he said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I think I've gotten used to it." Later that day, he stood with Sarah in the quiet stillness of the church graveyard. They stood before the grave of her father, a silent, shared acknowledgement of the past that had brought them to this moment. "He would have been proud of you, Sarah," Eli said. "He would have been proud of you too, Eli," she replied, her voice soft. "He always said you had the heart of a good man, even if the world had tried to beat it out of you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a new, deep understanding. "You're really leaving?" "I have to," he said. "The man who belonged here, he died 5 years ago. I'm just his ghost." "You're not a ghost, Eli," she said, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of simple, profound human connection. "You're the man who saved us." He saddled his horse, the one he had ridden in on, the sole survivor of his long, arduous journey. The townspeople gathered to see him off, a silent, respectful crowd. Sheriff Brody shook his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just 2 days before. His last stop was to see Sarah. She handed him a small package of food for the road, their fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric moment. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Don't know," he said, and for the first time in a long time, the not knowing didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a promise. "Somewhere the sun is bright, and the past is just a story." He mounted his horse and looked down at her, at the woman who had believed in a ghost. He knew he would never forget her. He turned his horse and rode out of Trinity Springs, not as a hunted outlaw, but as a free man. He did not look back. He rode towards the setting sun, a solitary figure on a vast, open horizon. His life was not perfect. His journey had been one of pain and loss. But it had been a life that had been rewritten, not by words or by promises, but by a single, final act of courage and forgiveness. The outlaw's last ride was over, and a new journey, the journey of Eli McGraw, had just begun.